Yes.
Yes, Jim.
I am.
Excuse me, I just need to start my recording. Go back. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you'll have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first. We will end the formal part of this webinar at noon Mountain Time and stop the recording at that point. After that, anyone who wishes to stay on for another 15-20 minutes to engage in a more informal conversation with our speakers is encouraged to do so. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today, Jim Zelenak and John Gannat. Jim is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service based out of its Montana Ecological Services field office in Helena. For the past 12 years, he has been the service's range-wide species lead for the distinct population segment of the Canada lynx in the contiguous U.S. During that time, he has led multi-regional efforts to evaluate and revise lynx designated critical habitats. Jim was the lead author of the 2017 Lynx Species Status Assessment and the 2023 Lynx SSA Addendum. Most recently, he has led a multi-regional, multidiscipline team to develop a recovery plan for the lynx distinct population segment. Jim has a bachelor's in wildlife science and environmental resource management from Pennsylvania State University and a master's in wildlife management from Montana State University. Our other speaker is John Gannat, who is a spatial ecologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in its Ecological Services Program based out of the Region 6 office in Lakewood, Colorado. John assists the service's field offices across the Mountain Prairie region with analytical, geospatial, and statistical needs for listing or delisting species under the Endangered Species Act, species status assessments. John's work also supports habitat conservation plans, recovery, critical habitat, climate vulnerability, and mitigation. John has a PhD in tropical environmental studies and geography from James Cook University in Australia. The title of today's webinar is Assessment of Current and Future Conditions of Canada Lynx in the Contiguous United States using Species Distribution and Climate Models. Well, thank you again to you both. And Jim, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Imtiaz. Thanks, everyone, for joining and tolerating those technical issues. It seems to never fail, but hopefully they're behind us, and we'll try to make up a little bit of lost time so that we can make sure we have time for Q&A at the end. So, John, if you can jump to the next slide.
Yeah.
So just a couple of objectives today, real quickly. I'm going to give a brief review of Canada lynx distribution, ecology, and population dynamics, talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act history and our thoughts on threats at the time of listing compared to now, talk a little bit about the SSAs, the SSA in 2017 and the addendum. Oops, John, they're going, yeah, okay.
Yeah, hold on.
That's good. And our approaches toward trying to understand the current and future conditions of lynx in the lower 48. And then we'll talk a little bit about the new species distribution models that have come out in the last few years out of the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and how we worked with those folks and with Imtiaz's shop to try to refine our understanding of potential climate impacts on lynx. Currently and through the end of the century, how that fed into a climate vulnerability assessment for the Lynx DPS in the recent SSA addendum, and then talk a little bit about what all that means in terms of recovery planning and the future of lynx in the lower 48. So thanks, John. Next one. So Canada lynx is a boreal species of the spruce-fir dominated taiga of northern North America. It occurs across roughly 6 million square kilometers, or about 2.3 million square miles, in Canada and Alaska, where it remains abundant and widespread across roughly 95% of its historical range. Because no acute widespread threats have been identified, and it has not suffered significant range loss or population decline, the taxon is designated a species of least concern by the IUCN. Canada lynx is one of 4 members of the genus Lynx, which also includes bobcats in the Americas and the Eurasian and Iberian lynx on the other side of the planet. Until recently, there were 3 recognized subspecies of Canada lynx, but in 2017, the cat specialist group of the IUCN concluded that morphological, genetic, and biogeographical data don't support the subspecies division, and they concluded that Lynx canadensis is monotypic. As you can see on the map, the southern periphery of the species range extends into the northern contiguous US, where there are fewer than 100,000 square kilometers, or a little over 38,000 square miles, of habitat that either supports or is potentially capable of consistently supporting lynx residency. So our portion of it, the distinct population segment, represents roughly the southern 1.5% of the species range. Lynx in the contiguous US were designated a distinct population segment and listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in the year 2000, and we'll touch a little bit more on that. So next slide, John. Just real quickly, most of you probably know, but lynx are often confused with bobcats, with which they are thought to compete for access to prey. We'll talk a little bit more about that too, but they do have some diagnostic features. They have very large paws. They're about twice the size of bobcat paws, and are thought to provide a competitive advantage for hunting in snow. Lynx and bobcat have hybridized in Minnesota and in eastern parts of the Canadian range. We haven't seen it in the West yet, but it could be happening. It just hasn't been documented. In addition to the large paws, and lynx also have long hind limbs, and so it gives them this kind of sloped or jacked up appearance that bobcats don't typically have. And then the ear tufts on lynx are longer. They're typically an inch or longer, and bobcat are typically shorter than an inch. And then finally, lynx have a shorter tail than bobcats, and it's completely black tipped, and compared to bobcats, which have a little bit of white on the underside. So historically, they've been confused, and trapping records are full of inconsistencies with identification, and so it makes it difficult to distinguish, bobcat range from lynx range based on historical records. So they're a mesocarnivore or a mid-sized carnivore. Lynx are typically 15 to 30 pounds, about the same size as bobcats. And I think that's it for that, John, if you want to go to the next slide. So the bottom line is Canada lynx is a prey specialist and therefore a habitat specialist. So lynx need snowshoe hares. They rely on snowshoe hares for typically upward of 90% of the biomass of their diet. And hares rely on moist boreal forest conditions. Oops, if you can jump back, John. So hares need conifer cover at ground and snow level, and often ideal conditions for hares are created by forest disturbance. Fire, insects, wind, timber harvest typically creates high quality hare habitat after a lag time from the disturbance. And of course, like most things, you can have too much of a good thing, and we'll talk about how we're starting to see a little bit too much disturbance in parts of the lynx range in the lower 48. So next slide, John. I think most folks are aware of the classic studies that have been done on snowshoe hare and lynx cycles. And so I just wanted to show these graphs to give folks a feel for what's going on, and what has kind of influenced our thinking on where lynx are in the lower 48 and where they can persist, and how that effort can be confused by these cyclic population dynamics, where we have historically seen big influxes of dispersing lynx into the lower 48 and confusing the issue of where they can be. Lynx are really, really good at getting across the landscape. And historically, when hare populations have crashed in the north, a lot of very hungry lynx have dispersed widely, including into the lower 48, often into non-habitat, out in the prairie plain states, the Dakotas and Nebraska, and southward in the east and in the west to places that don't contain habitat capable of supporting them. And what we see in these graphs is from west to east in the southern Canadian provinces, the peaks and troughs of the cycles starting in about 1920. And what you'll recognize in the west, it's pretty clear, and then it becomes less clear moving eastward, but there were big pulses of lynx in the early 1960s and again in the 1970s after several decades of very low level eruptions. The pulses in the 60s and 70s are thought to be like those that were typical in the 1800s. But then after about 1920, we had several decades where it seemed like that cycle was somewhat breaking down in the southern part of the range, probably influencing levels of immigration into the lower 48. And you can see these patterns, especially in Saskatchewan. You have those really dramatic peaks and then dropping off again. It's been less of a change in the cyclicity in the eastern Canadian provinces, where it seems like it's more typical. Anyway, during those pulses of the 60s and 70s, we had huge numbers of lynx show up in lots of places in the lower 48 and then disappear rather quickly from them. And however, those pulses kind of influenced many folks' thoughts on where lynx are and where they might occur in the lower 48. Next slide, John. This is just showing some of the work that Dr. Kevin McKelvey did at the Rocky Mountain Research, looking at the time lag between lynx records in the Canadian provinces and the lower 48 state. And he was one of the early proponents of this kind of tide, incoming tide and receding tide of lynx in the lower 48, and how a lot of lynx disappeared pretty quickly during those big immigration eruption pulses in the lower 48. But there were tide pools left behind where there are places down here where lynx can actually persist on the landscape. And he found that a 2 or 3 year lag time between the pulses in Canada typically coincided when we saw these big dispersal events, kind of mass synchronous dispersal events in the lower 48. Next slide, John. This is another figure from McKelvey's chapter 8 in the Lynx Bible. You can see the cover there, Ecology and Conservation of Lynx in the United States. This was a Herculean effort put together by Len Ruggiero and a lot of researchers to try to distill what we knew or didn't know about lynx in the lower 48 at about the time of listing. So this came out online in 1999 and was published in hard format in 2000. And chapter 8 was kind of the compilation of everything we know about records of lynx in the lower 48 up to that time. And Dr. McKelvey pointed out in this chapter and in chapter 2 or 3 of the book as well that we have all these dots on the map. Some of them are verified locations. Some of them are reliable but not verified. Some are anecdotal. And it paints a picture of where lynx has occurred, but you have to consider the influence of those eruptions and whether, try to distinguish between dispersing lynx associated with eruptions and those that constitute resident populations. And that's always been a struggle. I've looked into it, and it's something I don't think you can get a lot of resolution on, and there's always going to be questions about where lynx have been historically compared to where they are now and whether we've lost much. My assessment is that I think we have lynx populations in most places in the lower 48 where we had them historically. And as I'll go through here in a minute, when we listed the lynx, it was kind of an unusual listing under the Act, and it was different. So it's not, there's a misperception that anytime a species is listed under the Endangered Species Act, that it was because of major population decline or range contraction. And it's an understandable misperception because that's often the case, but it's not the case with lynx as far as we can tell based on verified historical data and more recent assessments of habitat capability. And so we'll get into more of that in a little bit. So this map just shows some of those pulses, those decadal pulses where lynx showed up in places often outside of habitat that could be construed as being supportive of lynx. So next slide, John. This is just real briefly, we listed the lynx in the Lynx DPS in 2000, and I'll talk about that factor D listing here in a bit. But this is just to show you that since 2000 and up till very recently, a lot of the work we've tried to do on Canada lynx is driven by litigation. So first to list them under the Act, and then to make sure they should be threatened instead of endangered, and then trying to move on towards recovery and get critical habitat designated. Both of those things are required under the Act. And the history of lynx and the Fish and Wildlife Service under the ESA has been driven largely by litigation, and that continues to this day. So John, if you want to go to the next one. Thanks. So like I said, in 2000, the Fish and Wildlife Service designated lynx in the contiguous U.S. as a single distinct population segment. That meant it's discrete from and significant to the larger taxon. And again, this was an unusual listing because we found, oops, if you can back up, John, yeah, thanks. We found that the only threat at the time of listing was under Factor D of the Endangered Species Act, the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. And here's a quote from that 2000 listing rule that says, we conclude the single factor threatening the contiguous US DPS of the lynx is the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. And this was specific to some federal lands in the Western lower 48. And it was particular to national forest land management plans and BLM land use plans as well. I think it's the only time, at least at that time, it was the only time we had listed a species under the Act solely because of the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. So next one, John. And maybe I'll just let folks read these, but it's more to show that there was a lot of information we didn't have, but the information we did have didn't suggest that we had seen major range contraction or population declines, that the relative rarity of lynx in the lower 48 and their occurrence at low density is kind of the natural condition, what you would expect on the southern fringe of a boreal species. And that historically, there are only a few places in the lower 48 that have the habitat capability, have the boreal forest conditions, the forest structural characteristics, and the snowshoe hare densities to be able to support lynx on the landscape over time. So I just wanted to reiterate that because we have seen even recently published papers that say by the year 2000, lynx had become so diminished in the lower 48 that they were listed under the Act. And it's really not that. And it is an exception to the more common theme of usually we list species when they have had documented population declines or significant range contractions. So not the case with lynx. Okay, next slide, John. So there will be a couple to step through here, but maybe you can stop after each square pops up there, John. Sorry about that. But
okay.
This shows the landscape where we have populations, resident populations of Canada lynx in the lower 48, or places that have a kind of an ambiguous history, historical condition, but where there's potentially some habitat capable of supporting them. And when we started to do the SSA back in 2015, it became the 2017 SSA, we realized there's a lot about the demographics of lynx we don't know. We still don't have statistically robust population estimates for most of the populations in the DPS. We have very little information on recruitment. We have almost no information on rates of immigration and emigration. So the kind of variables you need to put together a population viability analysis just don't exist for lynx, and they're very difficult to survey and develop population estimators for. And those problems may be with us for a long time. But we still had to try to get our head around what we have in the lower 48 and what the conditions of those populations are, what they might be moving forward, and try to assess in the SSA and the addendum the viability of the DPS based on the 3 R's of conservation, biology, redundancy, resiliency, and representation. So as part of that, recognizing all that we didn't know and that wasn't available in the scientific literature, we convened a panel of 10 recognized lynx experts from across the lower 48 range and across the border into Canada, and went through a formal expert elicitation process to try to get a better idea. So what the blocks are showing here is current estimates of each of the population sizes by the experts most familiar with those populations. And then in parentheses, I put my guesses based on digging through the historical data and what was available in publications of what that might have looked like historically. And you see right now in northern Maine, we have a population that's estimated at 750 to 1,000 lynx. And I think there's general agreement that that current population is much larger than the likely typical historical condition. And that is due to landscape level clear cutting in response to a spruce budworm outbreak in the 1970s and 80s that has resulted in a sea of really, really good regenerating spruce fir forests that is excellent snowshoe hare habitat. They had snowshoe hare densities there and lynx densities comparable to what we see in the northern part of the range, whereas typically in the lower 48 we see lower densities of lynx and typically lower densities of hares, or densities of both species that are more similar to the low in the population cycle in the core of the species range. So when you look at the amount of forest in Maine that for the last 20 or 30 years has been in an ideal condition post-disturbance, and compare that with the typical historical condition that we understand from forestry studies there, that maybe only 3% of that landscape was typically in that kind of condition, it's possible that we have, I would guess, at least twice as many, but maybe 6 or 7 or 8 times as many resident lynx in Maine now as was typical historically. And as those clear cuts from the 70s and 80s start to mature, we anticipate that we're going to lose some of the habitat capability there and see population declines, and are trying to work with the state of Maine, and it's mostly private lands in this part of the lynx range and private commercial timberlands to see what can be done with outcome-based forestry to make sure we can sustain a highly resilient population on that Maine, in the northern Maine area. There's been recent evidence last 10 or 15 years that that population has actually expanded a little bit southward and maybe into northernmost New Hampshire. And so that's a population that's doing much better now than we knew at the time of listing, and probably much better now than was typical under historical conditions. And so then jumping over to Minnesota, the Arrowhead region, at the time of listing, we didn't even know whether that was a population or just received periodic input in those eruptions from Canada. But since then, there's been a lot of research that's been done there by the state and the Superior National Forest, where most of the habitat occurs. And it's an area where we're getting some of our best estimates of population size using a genetic capture mark recapture system that was developed there. And it looks like there's a population there that's probably typically between 100 and 200 resident lynx with fluctuations. And it seems like it's been on an upward trajectory for about the last 10 years. And so that's good news. And that's a situation that's better than we thought at listing. And then as you look to the west, in western Montana, Dr. Squires with the Rocky Mountain Research Station estimates about 200 to 300 in that population. I think in some cases when habitat conditions have been poor, it could have been smaller than that. And then the fourth of our 4 native populations that we think have been there is in the North Cascades of Washington. It's a much smaller area of the Okanagan Forest on the east side of the Cascades and north of Lake Chelan. That is the one population where we think things have been worse recently than they were at the time of listing, because about 50% of the lynx habitat there has experienced wildfire and sometimes high severity wildfire in the last 20 years. Now we are starting to see some of those habitats regenerate to a point where they're good, or transitioning into good hare and lynx habitat again. But there was a thought that maybe that population had been cut in half from so much fire so quickly. And there's concern about the extent to which it might recover. Recent DNA collection up there detected 75 individual lynx over the course of 3 years, I think, of DNA collection, systematic DNA collection. So maybe some reason to be hopeful, but also with the way drought and wildfire have been in the West, some concern that some of that habitat might reburn again before it gets good or as it's just getting good. And then there were questions about the historical presence of lynx, both in the greater Yellowstone area, mostly of northwest Wyoming, and then in the southern Rockies. Certainly we have some verified records of lynx in both places. And right around the time of listing, we had a resident pair in the southern part of the Yellowstone, south of the park, that had some kittens. So there's been some reproduction, but it's been uncertain whether either the greater Yellowstone area or the southern Rockies historically supported a population most of the time, or if lynx presence there was naturally ephemeral, again, like you might expect on the southern range of a northern species, and with a highly dispersal capable individual. So recent habitat modeling that John will get into a little bit more shows there is some potential habitat in the greater Yellowstone, but a lot less of it than we thought historically and that other land managers thought historically. There was some evidence that in the 1970s, some lynx got into the greater Yellowstone during one of those eruptive pulses. But in contrast, there aren't records from Colorado and the Southern Rockies in the 60s or 70s, and there had been very, very few verified records in Colorado over the past 100 years. But in 1999, the state of Colorado initiated their Canada lynx reintroduction program there. And over the course of 6 or 7 years, translocated 218 lynx, and they have established resident breeding populations in the San Juans in the very southwest corner of the state and in west central Colorado in the Vail Pass, Leadville area. And so that's another place where lynx are better now. They're doing better now than they were at the time of listing, thanks largely to that effort by the state of Colorado. And again, that was another tremendous effort, and we've learned a lot about lynx translocation there. So that's kind of a summary. One other thing, between the upper left 2 circles, there's the Kettle Range in there that was not occupied at the time of listing, but where the Colville tribe and partners are working on a reintroduction effort now. And some of the recent habitat modeling suggests that there may be enough decent habitat there to support a small resident population. So we're hopeful for that as well. So that's kind of where we've thought things have been based on assessment of the historical record, current occurrence data, and the best professional judgments of the lead researchers from each of those regions. So John, if you can go to the next one. This is just a map that Fish and Wildlife Service has worked on recently to try to understand the occupied range in the lower 48, as well as areas where lynx either very occasionally or with some intermittent regularity may show up in between those areas. So not all of the green areas are full of lynx that are associated with a persistent resident breeding population. But the populations we do have are in those green areas and other places where there is some potentially capable habitat. All right, John, next one. So the threats, when we listed them again, it was inadequate regulatory mechanisms associated with Forest Service and BLM plans, but almost immediately, even before listing, those agencies were working with the service on conservation agreements that eventually led to science-based amendments to forest plans and land use plans that filled that regulatory gap and went a long ways towards addressing that threat. And even more recently, those agencies continue to work with the service to try to evaluate new available science and figure out how it might be brought to bear on forest management in a way that's beneficial to snowshoe hares and lynx. So that work is ongoing, but that threat has largely been addressed. And of course now, and for some time now, it's been pretty clear that the long-term threat to the DPS is projected climate warming, and a number of avenues shown here: loss of temperatures and snow conditions that provide lynx a competitive advantage over other terrestrial predators of hares. And we expect warming to result in the contraction northward and upslope of lynx habitats in the lower 48, which will lead to more isolated and fragmented patches of habitat and therefore populations. I just lost my screens again. Looks like they're coming back. Anyway, climate change may affect hare populations in the lower 48. It may affect changes in the northern cycles of hare and lynx, and therefore affect the levels of immigration we get into the lower 48. And as I hinted at earlier, we're seeing increased fire and insect activity, the size and intensity or severity of those events and the frequency. And even though disturbance historically is good for maintaining a mosaic of forest structural characteristics for lynx, like I mentioned, you can have too much of a good thing. I think in Washington recently, we've had too much fire, and in other parts of the western US, we've seen increasing fire as well. Not quite to that extent, but who knows what the future holds. It's hard to be optimistic about that. So a change in threats, and that changes how we might think about conservation and recovery. You can go to the next slide, John. So this is just a summary of, based on expert opinion from the original SSA in 2017, where we asked experts to give us their thoughts on how persistent these resident populations in the lower 48 might be. So geographic units 1 through 4 are those northern native populations. 5 is the GYA, and 6 is the Southern Rocky in Colorado. And we looked at short-term 2025. So a 10-year, when we were doing this back in 2015, a 10-year window of probability of persistence, then mid-century, end of century. And experts gave us their best thoughts on this, and we compiled all the data in a formal elicitation process. And the results showed that by 2050, experts weren't expecting dramatic declines or dramatic loss of extirpation of any of the populations in the lower 48. The Yellowstone's started out on a low note because we don't really think there's a resident population there right now, but occasional lynx on the landscape. But when we asked about the end of century, they said, well, we'll give you some numbers, but don't put a lot of stock in them. And so it was really fuzzy, a lot of uncertainty, even though the general trajectory was agreed that warmer for a northern species on the southern part of its range is not going to be good. But anyway, based on how the Fish and Wildlife Service tried to define foreseeable future under the Act, we felt that the DPS was fairly secure based on this input from experts and other assessments of resiliency, redundancy, representation, and recommended delisting, in essence, recognizing that it looks worse further out, but it's much more uncertain, and so not reasonably foreseeable. So we had a 5-year status review based on that SSA that recommended delisting. We were moving in that direction, but we were resued again. So we never did propose a rule to delist the DPS. John, if you can go to the next slide. So we had to respond to litigation, and we entered into settlement agreements, basically saying that we would draft a recovery plan and finalize it. And that should be out here in a few weeks. The draft plan was out last year at this time and had a 60-day public comment and review period. We've tried to refine the recovery plan based on that, and we're starting to set up workshops with partner agencies and tribes and others across the range to work on an recovery implementation strategy for each of the geographical areas. We also had a settlement agreement to revise the critical habitat designation for lynx once again. And so here in a few weeks, we will have a revised, proposed rule for a revised critical habitat. And that will also, it'll be published in the Federal Register and undergo 60-day public review and comment, and we'll evaluate that information and try to publish a final critical habitat rule roughly a year from now. But for both of those things, we had to do an addendum to the 2023 SSA to evaluate new science that had become available since 2015, 2017, and try to take advantage of some of the new science and some of the new tools available to us. So I think I have one more slide, John, and then I'll hand it off to you. So these are the SSA units in blue, and within them, the focal areas that we think support or might be able to support resident lynx in the lower 48. And this is based on some of the new habitat species distribution modeling that John is going to talk a little bit more about. And but the SSA addendum was again looking at what the new science said about the likely resiliency of each of these population areas and therefore the viability of the DPS. As we entered that 2023 SSA addendum, we knew that there were new tools available to assess the effects of climate change and new habitat modeling. And so we wanted to tighten up some of the stuff and see if we arrived at any different conclusions than we did through largely expert elicitation in the 2015-2017 effort. So I think that's all I have for now, John. I'll turn it over to you if you want to talk about climate vulnerability assessment.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Can you hear me? I can't see people because my slides are up.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the new habitat modeling that was published in 2000. This was information we didn't have in 2017. And then I'll kind of talk about how we leaned pretty heavily on this work by Lucretia Olson and John Squires from the Forest Service and several other co-authors to get our head around what we were going to do for a climate vulnerability assessment. So bear with me here a second. So this Olson paper that came out in 2020, 2021 really kind of changed the game, I think, in terms of the species distribution modeling, and it from the aspect of we didn't really have anything like this prior to when this paper came out. But I think the big takeaway for me, at least, was that we had a pretty good idea of what the strongest drivers of lynx distribution were based on this modeling effort, and that this was only done in the West. It wasn't done in Minnesota and in Maine. But regardless, the top, as you can see from this graph, the 4 of the top 5 strongest covariates predicting the distribution were either temperature or precipitation related. And by far the strongest one was this mean temperature of coldest month. And I guess I should, in an ideal world, what we would have done had we had time and staff capacity was take a similar approach to what Lucretia did from an SDM standpoint and project, these covariates forward into the future to come up with results that it would actually show us where we would potentially see distribution contract based on some of these changes in the future that we know are coming. The fact of the matter was we didn't have time to do that. We didn't have staff capacity. So we talked with Imtiaz and Alexei Sirin in Maine and some other people about, well, could we just push forward with with looking at the projections for the strongest covariate, this temperature of coldest month. And so I just want to kind of plant that in your head now. I'll talk about it more in a second. But one of the things that did come out of this modeling effort and subsequent efforts by the interagency Western Lynx bio team was to come up with these tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 areas of importance. Basically, tier 1s were the areas that we focused on for the climate vulnerability assessment, and tier 1s are kind of defined as and sorry about the slides, they're actually advancing on their own. But the tier 1s can support resident populations. Tier 2 and tier 3 may provide temporary habitat for dispersing and transient lynx. But at least for the climate vulnerability assessment, we focused on these dark blue tier 1 areas, which we think can support, or the most likely to support, resident lynx populations. In terms of the emission scenarios, we looked at these SSPs, the 245, the 37, and the 585. And if you look on the graph here, The 245 is this yellow line, which is kind of it's the business as usual scenario, kind of what we're on now. The 37 is an elevated emission scenario, and then the 585 is an even more elevated scenario. So some of the, and when we actually looked at projecting forward with this mean temperature of coldest month, we looked at all three of those emission scenarios, both for current, which is what you're looking at here, and then in 20-year increments into the future. So current is 2000 to 2020, and then we had 2020 to 2040, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and 80 to 100 for each of those three scenarios. But what really kind of came out of it was, again, that mean temperature of coldest month was the strongest covariate by a long ways, actually, within that species distribution model for the West. But what we've really kind of honed in on was the light blue areas are this -5 to -10 degrees C range that basically encompasses all the focal areas, and uncannily for north central Washington was almost spot on with where that focal area, the boundaries of that focal area lined up almost exactly with that temperature envelope. And so what we wanted to do was kind of look at this through time to see how this contracts. And the way we're looking at this mean temperature of coldest month is really as almost a proxy for potential snow conditions that are most favorable for lynx. And what you'll notice, though, is that the two focal areas in Maine and Minnesota are substantially colder in this -10 to -15 temperature threshold area. And what we think was going on there was that, and this was from MTAS, and I think he knows more of the climatology than I do, but I think, you know, the reason that we think that may be is because of higher humidities in those areas require colder temperatures to get the snow conditions that favor lynx. And so mean temperature coldest month was the highest or the strongest covariate for the West. And then we talked to Alexei Sirin in Maine, and he'd run some independent modeling, species distribution modeling, and also found that mean temperature of coldest month was the strongest predictor for Maine as well. That relationship wasn't as strong in Minnesota, but we think, again, MTS can probably expand on this better than I can, but due to there may be some increased complexity in the snow dynamics in that area due to lake effect snows. So I won't go into a whole lot of detail. If we want to talk about some of that later, we can. But in any event, all the focal areas are captured by either the 5 to 10 -10 degrees C or the 10 to -15 degrees C. And we wanted to walk this through time to see what those areas look like in the future based on the emission scenarios. And so here's roughly, I'm just going to show a couple of these. We have the whole series for all the emissions in the SSA, but so this is SSP 37. That was not the business as usual, but the one that was just above the business as usual. And you can see by 2050, some of these areas start to drop out in the West, but also I think more importantly is that you see Maine, where we have arguably the highest population of lynx in the lower 48, is completely out of that favorable mean temperature of coldest month window basically by mid-century. So that was cause for concern on our end. And then, Minnesota was still in the favorable range, but then if you looked at 2090, both of those focal areas are out of that range, and really the two holdout areas are the greater Yellowstone, where currently we don't have a lot of resident lynx, which is somewhat ironic, and then in Colorado in the Rockies. So that was a pretty sobering, I think, finding from our standpoint. And really, once we started looking at this kind of information, it really started to kind of weigh on us, because we were on that path to delist, but all of a sudden we have all this new information, and so we had to take another look at that as well. And this is just another way to look at the loss. So the spaghetti chart's basically color coded by the focal area. So the blue line is the Northeast. And then under the business as usual scenario, you're seeing that almost, roughly 70% of that main focal area is no longer favorable even by 2040. So you can kind of look at this, bifocal area through time. And if you step it through the different scenarios, you just see this contraction kind of speed up. This is the SSP 37 and then the SSP 585. But you can see, I guess, the big picture takeaway for me at least was, things don't look too good if we believe that temperature of coldest month is a good proxy for the snow conditions that give lynx a competitive advantage. And it's going to make our options smaller for recovery efforts. And I'm going to pass it back to Jim to talk about resiliency analysis. Are you still there, Jim?
Yep. Can folks still hear me?
Yeah, and Jim, you have 5 minutes, and
Okay,
then
yeah,
we need to get to Q&A.
We're almost at the end here, and I'll try to summarize this pretty quickly. But like John pointed out, I mean, the temperature modeling is it doesn't paint a very rosy picture for long-term persistence of lynx in the lower 48. And we have to make sure that folks understand that we feel a little better about the rigor of this analysis, but there's still some uncertainty about how exactly things are going to shake out. Part of the 2023 SSA addendum was an adaptive capacity analysis of lynx, and they have some natural history traits that are favorable for adaptive capacity, but more that are not. And the bottom line is we're on the edge of the range already. We're on the southern end of the range. Things are warming up, and they're a habitat and a prey specialist. And we don't think they are really going to be able to adapt in situ and suddenly become temperate forest cottontail specialists, or even be able to persist on these landscapes and continue to outcompete bobcat. The ranges overlap across most of the southern part of the lynx range. And it's thought that with warming, bobcats are going to move north and lynx are going to have to move north. And lynx are going to lose that competitive advantage. But there are some questions about how soon after we lose those favorable temperature envelopes will we see that translate into loss of habitat capability, these areas no longer being capable of supporting resident lynx. But we did this resiliency analysis, and we looked at the climate part of it, but we also looked at the amount of habitat, the size of the population, the extent to which they may remain well connected to the core of the species range in Canada. And this table just summarizes kind of what John was showing, in that right now we feel like we have 3 highly resilient populations in Maine, Minnesota, and in the northwest Montana, northern Idaho portion, and moderately resilient population in the Cascades of Washington and in the Southern Rockies due to the reintroduction effort there. But if the warming envelope happens, if the change in that happens the way the model suggests, and that does indeed lead to eventual after some lag time, loss of that habitat capability, we're looking at very challenging prospects for retaining lynx in the lower 48. So John, if you want to quick jump to the next slide, just a couple takeaways. So the habitat modeling that Lucretia and others did showed, again, I think every time we look, we find out that there's actually less good stuff for lynx in the lower 48 than we thought before. Part of that is erring on the side of the species based on the information you have, until you have new information that is more rigorous. And that Olson et al. Model, I think, is the most rigorous examination, using hundreds of thousands of highly accurate GIS location data of resident lynx and testing it. And so it really shows what the abiotic and biotic features are that distinguish lynx habitat from stuff that might look like lynx habitat but really isn't. Again, we have more resident lynx in Colorado and Maine now than we thought we did at the time of listing, and potentially more than historical. The inadequate regulatory threat at the time of listing has largely been addressed by federal agencies stepping up and working to develop the science and then incorporate the science into their management efforts. Some new science suggests there may be ways to tweak that if we want to optimize things for lynx persistence on the landscape. But clearly the long-term threat is continued accelerated anthropogenic climate warming that will likely shift these habitats northward and upslope. But as I said, there's still some uncertainty about lag times and how quickly things might fall apart. But I think there's general agreement that a warming world is more bad for lynx than it is good. We're not seeing any modeling that projects things are going to get colder and better. And therefore, we have to look at our recovery options in that framework. So John, if you can go to the next slide. So the recovery plan that'll be coming out, the final plan will focus on maintaining the resiliency we have to the extent that we can. You know, we don't feel like we've lost a lot up till now, but we think we're going to in the future. What can we do to retain the resiliency of those 5 DPS populations, maintain or enhance connectivity with the core of the range? What can we do to maybe proactively manage forests to increase resiliency to climate warming? How do we protect the most important stuff while maybe facilitating transition to higher quality habitat in some of the forests that have been affected by large fires or other disturbance factors? And then, of course, we don't want to backslide on the regulatory side of things and get right back to where we were for the reason for listing. So it's a challenging conservation for Canada lynx. And looking at the bigger picture of what the ESA is really intended to be, initially, you know, at its core, it's an Extinction Prevention Act. And we're talking about the southern 1.5% of the range of a northern species that is otherwise not in any immediate threat of extinction. How do we balance the need to try to conserve lynx in the lower 48 with other species for which climate warming may be a threat to narrow endemics where the entire taxon could be gone? And so it points to continuing struggles and hard conversations the service and its partners have with how to allocate limited resources to achieve the best conservation and to attempt to meet the objectives of the statute itself. So more to come on critical habitat designation in a little bit and the final recovery plan. The next slide is just a couple of useful links that, again, it'll be recorded, and so you'll have access to these, but some of the major pieces of work that we've done, as well as some that were done prior to us stepping into that. So I think that's the one more slide, John. You can go to questions, and we can see that we have enough time for a few questions. So thank you for your time and for that quick ramble through the things that are on our mind with Canada lynx conservation in the lower 48.
Oh, thank you, Jim, John. That was great. It's an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. We are on top of the hour, so we really out of time in some sense. We have, as I said in the text, 15 to 20 minutes of informal session after the formal presentation. But if there's a quick burning question, maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions at this point. So feel free to unmute and ask. Nathan.
Yeah, hey Jim. Thanks for the presentation and everything. Just quick, I don't know if it's appropriate for here or the informal, but on one of the slides it said that there's going to be a further revision to the 4D rule in 2025, apart from the final 4D rule coming out this year. Just want some clarification on what that might mean.
Yeah, so that was probably some residual from a previous slide program, but we do have a 4D rule for Canada lynx that that exempt some activities from violations of the Act under Section 9. We're looking into that for wolverine, but right now for lynx we have an exception for or an exemption for captive reared lynx, so like fur farms and zoos, but we have received notices of intent. It's not a notice of intent to sue, but a request from some organizations because they've documented some pretty poor conditions for captive lynx in some of these roadside type zoos. And so we're trying to figure out what to do for that. Fur farms and zoos those lynx are not part of the DPS, right? The DPS is wild lynx on the landscape. And we think there's some educational value to having Canada lynx in zoos, but we're looking at whether or not we can strengthen that a little bit and provide an exemption for accredited zoos and maybe do something to curb some of the lynx that are kept in pretty horrendous conditions and some of those roadside attraction type things. So yeah, so we will be looking into that. I don't know that that's probably on a separate timeline than the critical habitat now. We're trying to get the critical habitat proposed rule out in a week or so to meet a court order deadline, and then it's typically a year for us to finalize that after we evaluate comments we receive during the 60-day comment period and any new science. So, but yeah, that's about all I have on the 4D.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jim.
Yep.
Jim, there's a question in the chat. Terry, you want to ask the question yourself? The question, the European lynx productivity, and have found that lynx expanding habitat southward with lack of snow and good reproduction. Is there any indication of that here with hare habitat available without kind of the snow piece?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll take a stab at it. You know, I think we certainly have boreal forest-like components and snowshoe hares outside of the areas that support lynx. We think if they could exist there, they probably would, but there's some kind of limitation. I think Canada lynx are a little bit more highly dependent on snowshoe hares than Eurasian lynx are. They have different suite of prey over there. I don't know that they're as tied to the cold, snowy boreal conditions that Canada lynx are. But like I said, in Maine, we've seen with that population that was going gangbusters as all of those clear cuts aged into really, really good high density snowshoe hare habitat, there's been some expansion southward, and maybe some recolonization of northern New Hampshire. And so that's a good sign, but my take is I think that it's very unlikely that lynx are going to broadly expand southward into a less cold and less snowy future. I think the likelihood is that they're going to contract with the snow conditions, the temperature conditions, and the hare densities that we expect warming will push those northward. I don't know if that helps, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. I think we'll end the formal part of the presentation at this point. I'll stop the recording.